I was thinking of what's a good illustration for the book of the Bible that we're going to be looking at. And I'll tell you what popped in my head was Groundhog Day. And we'll see why in a minute, but do you remember this movie? This was a movie where he wakes up, he's kind of a grumpy guy, he's kind of a Scrooge kind of a character. He wakes up one day and he lives out that day, and then he wakes up the next day and he lives out the same day again and again and over and over and over. And there's apparently a book that this comes from, and he lives that same day apparently thousands of times in the original story. Of course, they couldn't show that in the movie, but he lives out the same day over and over and over. It's a cycle. It happens again and again. And the reason why this popped into my head today is probably not the reason that you might think. It popped into my head today because I thought this would illustrate what we're going to talk about. And then I thought, I wonder what day Groundhog Day actually is. I wonder when that is. So I looked it up, and it turns out it's today. Totally, I mean, I can't say random, but it was just a weird little thing. It's like, oh, it's Groundhog Day today. We're going to use Groundhog to illustrate just kind of a funny occurrence. And so, what is the book of the Bible that we're going to be looking at? Maybe some of you guys already have a sense of it if you're familiar with the Old Testament. But the book we're going to be looking at is Judges. And in Judges, what we have is this cycle. It's a cycle that happens over and over again. In fact, in the first couple of chapters, it tells us about this cycle. It kind of sets us up to expect it. So what I want to do is give you a little bit of background information about what leads up to the book of Judges. And so let's just back up, let's sort of rewind in the story a little bit to a number of years before the book of Judges takes place. So the children of Israel are in Egypt. They're enslaved and they need a deliverer. So God brings Moses to Egypt and sets his children free. They wander in the desert for a number of years, and they eventually move to the location where they are poised to take the land of Canaan. And that is the promised land, the land that God had promised to the children of Israel. They pass over the River Jordan, and Joshua, sort of the next generation after Moses, leads the conquest of the promised land. Joshua leads the armies to take over the area that God had promised. And God leads them. God drives out many of the people before them. And it's an amazing story. I don't know if you've ever read Joshua, but it's one of those just incredible stories in the Bible. And then what comes right after that is this period where the people of Israel are now settled in the land, so to speak. But it's not really a peaceful settlement. It's a place of war and difficulties. And we'll see in the first few chapters why that is. So it's not smooth sailing. And at this point, it's important to realize that there is no king in Israel. There is no central monarch. And in fact, we're going to discover what the leadership type is in the area. So you can imagine the kind of anarchy that would happen in a place that has no official leadership. There's no monarchy, and there's not even a government, so to speak. It's really just a number of tribes living in various areas within the land. So let's take a look at something that God commanded. He commanded the generation before the judges to do. And this command continued into Judges. And so what we're going to see is a generational problem. God gives a command to a generation, and that generation does not accomplish it. And that affects every generation after him. Here's the command that God gave as the children of Israel were coming into the promised land. He says, when you cross the Jordan into Canaan, drive out all the inhabitants of the land before you. Now, notice a very important word in that sentence. He says, drive out all the inhabitants of the land before you. Now that's a big task. God does not give commandments that he's not going to help his people fulfill, of course, but he commands them to drive out all the people. He says, destroy all their carved images and their cast idols, and demolish all their high places. Take possession of the land and settle in it, for I have given you the land to possess. Now, there's a second very important instruction in here. And the instruction is to destroy all their carved images. Those are idols. Those are false gods. So God is telling them to destroy their false gods and to break down their idols. And then it says demolish their high places. You may say, well, what's a high place? Well, up on the mountains, there's mountains in the land of Israel. And up on the mountains, up on the highest places, there were places of false worship. There were what they called altars to Baal. There were what they called Asherah poles, which were a type of pagan ritualistic pole that they would use to worship Asherah. And so these were places that were up at the high points on the mountains. And so what God said is you need to drive the people out. You need to destroy all of their false worship, and you need to go up on the mountains and you need to break down those altars. That's God's command. Now, what we're going to see in Judges is that the people half-heartedly do some of this, but they don't ultimately accomplish what God has told them to do. Now, in case we have the idea that they don't do it because it's really hard, I want you to remember that idea that what God commands us to do, He's going to make us able to do. Doesn't mean it's easy. Doesn't mean necessarily it's even simple. But He makes us able to accomplish what He commands us to do. And the same is true of the children of Israel. So let's look at chapter 1. Now I'm just going to let you know, I've put the numbers for the verses next to the verse that we're going to look at because we are going to skip certain verses. I encourage you to read through Judges. We're going to skip certain verses. In later weeks, we're going to come back to some of those verses to kind of make sense of some of the things. So what we're going to do is, it's almost like an overview of the first few chapters. Here's what verse 1 says. It says, after the death of Joshua. Now, we already talked about that, but that lets us know where we are in the timeline. Joshua has died. Now, it's going to talk a little bit about what happened in Joshua's time in the first chapter, but it's basically telling us the setting of this story is after Joshua's conquest. Verse 4, 8, and 10 say, when Judah attacked, the Lord God gave the Canaanites and the Perizzites into their hands. Now you may be saying, well, what's going on here? Well, remember, God's commandment was for the children of Israel to drive out the peoples that were in Canaan. And the reason for that is because they were incredibly evil and they worshiped other gods. Many of the practices of these other tribes that were already in Canaan, their worship was disgusting and awful, even sacrificing children in some of their rituals. And so God commanded them to drive out these people. Now notice, this is Judah. So this is one of the tribes, one of the 12 tribes of Israel. This is Judah's report card. When Judah attacked, the Lord gave the Canaanites and Perizzites into their hands. That reminds us that God makes us able to do what He commands us to do. God was with Judah when they did this. But notice what it says. The men of Judah attacked Jerusalem also and took it. They advanced against the Canaanites living in Hebron and defeated them. So Judah has some success. But let's notice what it says after that. The Lord was with the men of Judah. They took possession of the hill country, but they were unable to drive the people from the plains. Now, why were they unable? Was it because they didn't have the physical strength? Was it because they lacked the technology in war? Oh, I think it's pretty obvious. They were not able because they did not trust God to go down into the valley and do what they needed to do. And we see this cycle over and over. Judah really is the tribe who has the best report card. Let's notice what the other tribes, how they operate. The Benjamites did not drive out the Jebusites who were living in Jerusalem. It tells us in 22, now the tribes of Joseph attacked Bethel, and the Lord was with them. But Manasseh did not drive out the Canaanites, nor did Ephraim drive out the Canaanites. But by the way, the tribes of Joseph, we don't usually call them Joseph's tribe or the tribe of Joseph. Joseph had two sons, and so there were two half-tribes. So Manasseh and Ephraim are the two tribes of Joseph. And so they both engaged to some extent in war, but they did not fully drive out the people like God told them to do. Notice what it says in 28. When Israel became strong, they pressed the Canaanites into forced labor, but never drove them out completely. So here's what it seems like they're doing. They look at the situation and they think, well, we could drive them out like God told us, or, you stick with me here, maybe we could use them for our own benefit. You see, we'll take them and we'll turn them into our servants. Okay, so they take some of the Canaanites and they say, you know, what we're going to do, we're not going to drive you out. You can stay, but you're going to work for us. You're going to do our labor for us. Now, that is not what God told them to do, is it? What God told them to do is drive them out, and he used the word completely. Notice here it says, instead of that, they used the people for their own purposes, and they didn't drive them out completely. So we're beginning to see this pattern. Neither did Zebulun drive out the Canaanites in their territory. The Asherites lived among the Canaanite inhabitants of the land because they did not drive them out. Now in this one, notice they don't even press them into labor. They just live among them. They just say, you guys can stay, we'll get along, it'll be cool. And so they live there together. 33, the Naphtalites who lived among the Canaanites, inhabitants of the land. The Amorites confined the Danites to the hill country, not allowing them to come down into the plains. You say, what's going on there? Well, Dan was one of the tribes of Israel, and they're up in the far north. Okay, so they're in kind of the hill country. What we see here is that they have to live up in the hills because the Canaanite people won't even let them come down out of the hills. So basically what we're seeing here is this is not a full success. This is Israel. It has moved into the promised land, but they have not fully realized the promise. And what we have to take from this is that it's because they did not do what God told them to do. Probably because what God told them to do was unpleasant. It was not enjoyable to drive the people who lived there out, but it was God's command. Chapter 2. We did chapter 1 pretty quick. I'm proud. Let's do chapter 2. And by the way, what's interesting about Judges is chapter 1 feels almost like a large overview of a long segment of time. And then chapter 2, it's almost like it rewinds a little bit and gives a little bit more detail about some of the things that it just talked about. So here's what chapter 2 says. The angel of the Lord went up from Gilgal to Bochum and said. Now, what's interesting about this is we think that this is one of those times in the Old Testament where the Lord Jesus manifests himself to the people. Now it says that he's the angel of the Lord, but I want you to notice one of the things he says when we read through these words. Excuse me. The angel of the Lord says, I brought you up out of Egypt and led you into the land I swore to give to your ancestors. I said, I will never break my covenant with you. Now, why do you think we say this is God in the form of the Lord Jesus, pre-incarnate, rather than just an average angel? Because no average angel, no messenger from heaven could say, except for God, could say, I brought you up out of Egypt, and I led you out of the land, and I swore to give you your ancestors. Who is it that made these promises to the people of Israel? It was God. And so this must be in some form God. But notice it doesn't say that it's God. It says it's the angel of the Lord. And so our best understanding of this is the person of Christ before he came to earth. And that is fascinating to me. We have a number of these in the Old Testament. And I love when we see them because it gives us a whole kind of new vision of who Christ is. So, now, let's kind of analyze what he says. He says, I brought you up out of Egypt. I led you into the land. I swore to give to your ancestors. I said, I will never break my covenant with you. Now, notice what he's saying. Now, I'm going to emphasize this word. He's saying, I will never break my covenant with you. Implication being, what are you doing? I'm not going to break my covenant, but what are you guys doing? We made an agreement. We had a pact here. I'm not going to break my end of it, but let's think about how you guys are performing. Notice what he says next, and you shall not make a covenant with the people of this land. So he's kind of reiterating what the covenant was. What was the agreement that we had? It was that you shall not make a covenant with the people of this land, but you shall break down their altars, yet you have disobeyed me. Why have you done this? Rhetorical question, right? Because the reason that they've done it probably are pretty obvious. The reasons are probably because it's difficult, it's inconvenient, it's unpleasant to follow what God told them to do. And also, by the way, most of the worship of these foreign gods, it's very self-centered. It's very sin-centered. There's things that people who worship these other gods get that they want. And so it is a self-centered worship when the children of Israel would worship these other gods. So this angel of the Lord, which we think is Christ, speaks to them in this way and challenges them. Notice what he goes on with. And I said, and I have also said, I will not drive them out before you. They will become traps for you, and their gods will become snares to you. This is really interesting to me because God tells them what they're supposed to do. When they don't do it, God tells them what's going to happen because they didn't obey Him. So what He tells them is their gods are going to trip you up. They're snares. Snares is like a trap. It's like something you might catch a small animal in. It's something that ensnares people. And so he says their gods are going to do that to you. You think it's innocent. You think it's easy. You think it's fun. But it's going to cause all kinds of trouble. And so what God is telling them here is, I'm going to allow this to happen to teach you a lesson. And he's going to go on to say that it's to test them. When the angel of the Lord had spoken these things to all the Israelites, the people wept aloud. There they offered sacrifices to the Lord. Now at this point we see the first of this cycle where God reaches down to the people who have become very rebellious, and He does something to draw them back. And they, for a time, have repentance. But it begins to become a cycle even this early in the book. The people served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and of the elders who outlived him and who had seen all the great things the Lord had done for Israel. Now this is a point where the narrator is kind of jumping back to some backstory to tell us what had been happening. Okay? So what had been happening is the people had been serving the Lord, and they served the Lord while Joshua was alive. And even those elders who were alongside of Joshua, they served the Lord even while they were still alive. And the implication is because they could still tell the stories of what God had done. They were still able to lead and guide the nation. And in the ancient world, one of the things about culture in the ancient world is that it was very elder-driven. And so younger people would listen to their elders. A novel idea, isn't it? We've sort of lost something in our culture, I think. But the younger people would listen to their elders and they would follow their direction. But as those elders begin to die, something begins to shift. Notice what it says next. And this is an incredible and powerful verse, maybe one of the best known verses in all of Judges. It says, after that whole generation had been gathered to their ancestors. So which generation are we talking about? This is the elders who knew Joshua and had seen the things that God had done. And when it says gathered to their ancestors, what it means is they died. Okay? So after that older generation died, notice what happens. Another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what He had done for Israel. That's powerful. And that's pretty incredible when you think about it. Another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what He had done for Israel. How in the world is that possible? You have people who wandered through the desert, who saw the pillar of fire and the pillar of smoke, who saw water come out of a rock. Now some of them, many of them, passed those stories down. And so those stories should still be fresh in the minds of the people. But what it tells us is that this next generation, they didn't know about that stuff. So there is some kind of disconnect between the last generation and the next generation. Excuse me. And so there is something broken here. There is some problem with the transmission of these ideas and these concepts about God. So notice what it says. Then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord and served the Baals. So this is a cause and effect statement. It's about what does the next generation understand about God and what happens to them when they don't understand it. And what they miss out on is understanding and realizing what God has done for His people. And when they miss out on that story, when they miss out on that understanding, they become evil. They follow the Baals. They follow the idols of their time. This is an incredible statement about culture. Now here's the thing. And I think this is why it's so powerful for us today. It still happens. It still happens. I mean, my parents shared certain stories with me, but they chose the stories that they shared. You have to condense as you share your stories with the next generation. And it becomes very important what stories we pass on. It becomes very, very important what ideas and concepts we give to our children and even our children's children if we are fortunate enough to live to see our grandkids. So that is something that was broken in the early phase of Israel. It goes on to say, they forsook the Lord, the God of their ancestors, who had brought them out of Egypt. They followed and worshiped various gods of the peoples around them. They aroused the Lord's anger because they forsook Him and served Baal and the Ashtoreths. This is so sad. Now, it's easy for us to kind of condense this and make it just a simple, oh, no big deal. But this was a huge deal. Because in our minds, the worship of these foreign gods looks tame. I mean, in our imagination, it was not tame. It was a disgusting, filthy set of practices when the people would follow these other gods. Things that I will not even say aloud here. Awful practices that I would not even speak in a public place, they would do in the name of these foreign gods. And so if you have the idea that it's just God being sort of petty and sort of jealous, no, it has to do with deep-seated evil and disgusting practices that God wanted to keep His people pure from for their own good. Not because He's a killjoy, but because it's good for the people to stay away from these awful, deplorable acts. Notice what it says next. In His anger against Israel, the Lord gave them into the hands of the raiders who plundered them. He sold them into the hands of the enemies all around whom they were no longer able to resist. So here, it'd be very easy for the Israelites to say, see, God doesn't care about us. God isn't with us. And what God is actually doing is allowing them to feel the effects of their own sin. They sin, He allows them to feel the consequences. And isn't this something that we experience even in our life today? I mean, if when you became a believer, God forced you not to sin ever again, it might be difficult for you to learn the consequences of your sin. But what we find even in the New Testament, like in Romans, it tells us that God will turn people over to the consequences of their sin if they insist on following that certain path. This is something as ancient as even the earliest stories in the Old Testament, that God turned them over and allowed the plunderers, allowed the people around them to come in, and for the children of Israel, they experienced those difficult and painful consequences of their sin. And notice that last line there, which I think kind of sums up everything we've seen so far. They were in great distress. Now, in every story, there's the setting, right? And usually it comes at the beginning of the story. It's kind of a short little description of what has happened so far and where we are so that we can understand why the story matters. And every story, I don't know if you've noticed this, but every story is about the characters changing. Okay, so you have a character and there's a story arc and they change over time. And so this is the starting point for the children of Israel. This is where they are. They're in great distress, and ultimately their distress comes from the fact that they cannot stop sinning. They cannot stop chasing these foreign gods. Then the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hands of these raiders. Now, that sounds simple, right? That sounds like, okay, good, God fixed it. But what it says next is really interesting. But let's just kind of break this down. The Lord raised up judges. Now, what is a judge? For us, we have a pretty narrow idea of a judge. A judge is probably someone who sits in a courtroom, has a really sweet black robe that they get, maybe even on TV, there's some TV shows where there's like judges that do like these daytime court things. That's kind of our idea of a judge. But in the ancient sense, a judge could be that, but also an elder of a city. Someone who listens to different disputes, listens to different debates, listens to different ideas, and judges what to do. How to lead, where to take the people, how to direct and guide the culture. So a judge, in the ancient sense, was a much wider and broader concept than we have today. And as we go through the book of Judges, we're going to continue to develop that idea of what a judge is. So it's important to see that it's God that raises up these judges. It's not just random men and women. And yes, there are women who are judges in the book of Judges, which is really exciting. it's God that raises up these men and women. It's not just someone who says, I'm going to pull myself up by my bootstraps and I'm going to do an election campaign and then we'll lead everybody. It's actually God who leads and guides these people that then in turn lead and guide His people. So then the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hands of these raiders. Now notice what it goes on to say, yet they would not listen to their judges. Okay, so they would accept the help of their judges in a military sense. They would follow them into battle so that they could push back their enemies. But notice it tells us that they don't listen to their judges. They don't take the advice of their judges, but prostituted themselves to the other gods and worshiped them. So it's like, I'll accept your help when I am in real distress, but once things get good, I'm going to go back to my bad habits. I mean, haven't we seen this? I don't know if you guys remember this show. I can't remember what it was. I think it was called Intervention or something like that. But it was this show where they would have somebody who was in a really bad addiction situation, and their family and friends would come around and they would do an intervention. And usually the stories that would come out of that is, this is not the first time we've tried to help our addict brother or our uncle or whoever. It's a cycle. It keeps happening. When he hits rock bottom, he'll listen and he'll take our help. But once he climbs back out, he's back on drugs, he's back, robbing and stealing, whatever it is. And it's very similar in the book of Judges. That when they are in incredible distress, they'll follow the judges into battle and they'll accept their leadership so that they can get out of the distress. But once they're out of the distress, they go back to their addictions. And for them, their addictions are these foreign gods. And I think it's not by accident that it uses the word prostituted. Notice that. That tells us how serious and disgusting the practices are that they were engaged in when they worshiped these foreign gods. Now, then it says, they quickly turned from the ways of their ancestors who had been obedient to the Lord's commands. Notice the word quickly. It isn't like it gradually happens over time. Once they get out of the distress, once their enemies stop lobbing rocks at them or whatever it is, stop fighting with the sword with them, they quickly go back to their habits. It gets even worse. Whenever the Lord raised up a judge for them, He was with the judge and saved them out of the hands of their enemies as long as the judge lived. For the Lord relented because of their groaning under those oppressed and afflicted them. Excuse me. So what it says is that God raises up this judge, and as long as the judge is alive, things are pretty good. The people are kind of protected. It's almost like the judge is an umbrella for the people because this judge has this relationship with the Lord. And so He relents during that time. But it's as if as soon as the judge is away, the children begin to do awful things. It's sort of like, many of you have kids. It's like when you went out of town, when you had teenage kids, your kids did who knows what. But then when you came back, they sort of behaved. It's a very similar thing. It's like the leadership, once the leadership disappears, the people go crazy, so to speak. Verse 19, but when the judge died, the people returned. And by the way, this is not talking about one judge. This is talking about the cycle. So there's multiple judges in Judges, of course. But this is saying what happened each time a judge was raised up. But when the judge died, the people returned to the ways even more corrupt than those of their ancestors. Now, by the way, this answers one of those great questions that we have. Why does culture constantly get worse? This is it. It's because when this cycle happens, and it still happens today, but when this cycle happens, people return to something worse, not better. People don't naturally get better. When you say, well, why in the world do we have pockets of societies where they're more moral and they're more godly? Well, that's because of Jesus' influence on culture. But ultimately, if you let culture go, especially if God does not have a say in culture, this is what happens. It gets worse and worse and worse, and it cycles through what it calls even more corruption as time goes on. So when the judges died, or when each judge died, the people returned to ways even more corrupt than those of their ancestors, following other gods and serving and worshiping them. They refused to give up their evil practices and stubborn ways. So these people are stubborn, they're evil, and they will not give up what they have chosen to follow. Verse 20, therefore the Lord was very angry with Israel and said, because this nation has violated the covenant I ordained for their ancestors and has not listened to me, I will no longer drive out before them any of the nations Joshua left when he died. So what God is saying is, hey, that's enough. I'm so mad, I'm so frustrated, I'm going to let you guys experience the consequences of your sin, and that's that. I will use them to test Israel and see whether they will keep the way of the Lord and walk in it as their ancestors. In a sense, this is the setup for the rest of the book, right? This is explaining what's about to happen. And now the rest of the book, and we'll see it in future weeks, the rest of the book sort of zooms in. We're kind of looking at a zoomed out view in these first two chapters. The rest of the book is going to zoom in on individual judges and the effect they had on the nation. But this is ultimately why judges exist, because of this cycle and what God said He's going to do. He's going to allow these enemies of the children of Israel to continue to persist in the area so that He can test His people. And as we can imagine, teach them quite a few lessons through the process. And we're going to look at just a few verses in chapter 3. The nations the Lord left were left to test the Israelites to see whether they would obey the Lord's commands, which He had given their ancestors through Moses. Now, this is kind of restating what we've already seen. And it tells us this kind of final statement, and we'll kind of wrap on this. The Israelites lived among the Canaanites. Okay, now I want us just to remember that commandment that God gave them. God commanded them to drive the Canaanites out, but this is ultimately summarizing everything we just saw. The Israelites lived among the Canaanites. And for the early Jewish mind, this needed an answer, because God commanded them to drive out and to live in a pure sense, culturally and religiously, in the land of Israel. And one of the great questions is, why do our enemies persist? And the last 2.5 chapters are basically answering that. They're basically saying why this situation exists. It's because of sin, but it's also because God, as a result of that sin, has allowed this test to continue. Verse 6, they took their daughters in marriage and gave their own daughters to their sons and served their gods. Can you imagine anything more telling than who you allow your kids to marry? I mean, this tells you how intimate they were with the pagan cultures around them. Now, it might be one thing to say, well, they would only do business with them sometimes. I mean, that'd be sort of one level. You might say, well, they're business partners, but, they don't intermingle on weekends or something. That'd be another level. No, this is a very deep level of intimacy. They allow their children to marry the children of these pagan cultures. I mean, this week it struck me as I was watching Eiley. She's 5 years old. She was running around the living room just having a good time, and I thought, someday she's going to be married, and that's going to hurt. I don't know why. I just know that there's going to be some frustration with that process probably. I mean, I hope it goes wonderful and she finds a wonderful, godly man, but as we all know, it doesn't always work that way. But I can tell you how I will respond if she finds someone that's not godly. I will find that very difficult. And so the people that we allow our children to marry have a pretty good, the people are, let me start that sentence over. The people we allow our children to marry is a pretty good indication of how intimate we are with the culture around us. And so the Israelites, this tells us where they were. They were very intimate with the pagan culture around them. They were very intimate with the practices of the pagan culture around them. Maybe to the point that if you plopped yourself down in this time frame in Israel, you might not be able to tell the difference. You might say, oh, it's just all one culture. And that's the way culture works. We call it assimilation. Cultures merge. And it's God's commandment for the Israelites that they would fight against that assimilation. But what Israel did is they allowed that tide to flow. So, it's a generational problem. And I'd love to say that it doesn't exist today. I mean, that would be really convenient, right? I mean, if this generational problem didn't continue. Now, I would say we have an advantage. We have the Holy Spirit. We have God at work in a different way today than He was at work in the era of the judges. And I think even all of us in the room are evidence of that. But there does come some questions that I think are really important. And we'll see that in a second. After that whole generation had been gathered, and we're reminding ourselves of what this says. After that whole generation had been gathered to their ancestors, another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what He had done for Israel. Then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord and served the Baals. Now, I think we could interject ourselves into this verse, couldn't we? Or these verses. It seems to me, the stories that I hear is that in the last generation, and you guys could tell me better probably, but in the last generation, it was more common to find people that, at least on the surface, respected Judeo-Christian morality. It was more common, at least on the surface, to find people that went to church. It was more common to not hear people denigrating and complaining about faith, especially the Christian faith. And so it seems to me that things have changed. Now, give me one of these or one of these if I'm wrong. I mean, do you feel that? Do you feel like in the last generation things have shifted? I feel that, even though I'm younger than some of you guys. I feel that. I feel that there's been a shift even since I was a junior high kid. I feel like the world has really changed a lot. And this is not to scare you. I'm not a fearmonger. I totally trust that God has got a plan. But I think it's valuable to recognize it. I think it's valuable to realize that things are shifting probably more quickly than they have in a very long time. Maybe quicker than they ever have. And I think a lot of it is because of the internet. The change that the internet and having handheld devices full of information, full of different ideas, it has changed the way that people's brains work. It's changed the way that people think and people interact. And so the world is shifting very quickly. And some of that shift is great, but some of it is very, very scary. And I think some of it feels quite similar to what we see in Judges. And so, every generation must fight on their own. That's what I pick up from this, is that each generation is responsible ultimately for themselves, okay? So people in my age bracket, people younger than me, each of us are responsible for our own generation. And I can't completely say it's my grandparents' fault if I fail. But we're not really alone, right? I mean, we overlap. I mean, my generation, we're going to answer for ourselves, but we could probably do better if we have some help from those that are older than us. And the chain goes on and on and on. So each generation must fight on their own. The fight doesn't end when your kids are grown. Notice that rhymes. I like rhyming phrases. The fight doesn't end when your kids are grown. Now, I know this is a sensitive thing to say to any audience, but it's definitely a sensitive thing to say to an audience with kids who are grown. The fight for our children continues until either I or they are dead. It continues the rest of our life. Now, this is a sensitive thing, though. Because once our children, and I don't have adult children yet, but once our children are adults, it becomes much more sticky and difficult to figure out how do we continue to influence them in a godly and a positive way. And I'm not going to stand up here and tell you I know how to do that. But what I do see is that there's danger when we don't fight. There's danger when we completely pull out. And I think that's exactly what we see in the first chapters of Judges, is that there was an older generation that had such an incredible story to tell with the younger generation. And for some reason, there was a break. There was some shift where that younger generation was not getting the message. Now, it wasn't completely the older generation's fault. It wasn't completely the younger generation's fault. They were shared in this battle. Ultimately, the younger generation is the one that answers for it. But it makes me think that older generation who had walked through the wilderness and walked with Joshua and known Caleb, and some of them, maybe even, probably none of them by this point would have known Moses, but they knew the stories, those older generation, they had something so special to share. Now, here's the thing I think that happens with those who have an important story to share. I can't say we, but I can understand how it becomes difficult when someone who has a story to share doesn't feel like it's wanted. It doesn't feel like it's accepted. Doesn't feel like it's invited. And my dad, I've had these conversations with my dad. He tells me that when me and my brothers became adults, he became very careful with unsolicited advice. He said it's a great way to ruin a relationship. And so there's an amazing, I hear some moans on that one. Yeah. So there's a balance here. And I don't think I have the wisdom to tell you how to do it. I think we have to approach this with an incredible amount of balance, but it's a reminder how important it is, I think, to at least continue that conversation. And so the fight doesn't end when our kids are grown. I'm hopefully going to continue to fight for my children and their generation as long as I still have breath in me. And I hope that you do too, because we need you. I'm talking to you guys like most of you are older than me, and I can say that honestly. We need you. We need your voice. We need you to speak into our generation. It's so important. Now, let me just tell you, my generation is full of know-it-alls. You hear me saying this, but you may not hear this from others. But if they say they don't need you, they're wrong, because we see it all through Scripture. We see it so many times where a younger generation or even a younger person disregards the wisdom of those who are older, and it is to their own detriment. Now, I don't know how to break through that. I think in every relationship it's probably different, and that's going to be the battle that I fight when my kids are older, but I want to encourage you to keep at it. To keep connections with, whether it's with your adult children or maybe it's with coworkers who are younger. I don't know who it is, but this generation that you're looking at right here on the stage, we need you. We need you to speak up. One more thing. How are we going to prepare our kids to fight on their own? Because at some point, we no longer get the influence. Now, that may happen before we die, right? I mean, heaven forbid, but let's say that my relationship with my kids gets severed or I get estranged or something awful happens. There's going to be a point where I no longer have influence in my kid's life. And that's really sad to think about, but I hope that never happens while I'm still living. At some point, though, I think probably at the moment of my death, I no longer will have influence. And at that moment, I better have prepared my kids. I better have done everything that I can to make sure that they're ready to fight on their own and to help their kids fight. Now, my parents still do this with me. Now, like I said, they're very gentle about this. They don't force advice. I could say my parents and my in-laws, actually. Part of it is because I ask for advice. I'll give you an example. I'm working on a new book. And it's personal stories, and there's some things in there that I did when I was in college that are a little embarrassing. Not illegal or anything, but just kind of embarrassing. But I feel like I need to share those stories. But I shared the manuscript of that book with both my parents and my in-laws, and I said, read this, tell me what you think. And it made them a little nervous. And we made some edits because of it. And that was me seeking their advice. Now, in some ways, what I found inside of me is, I don't know if I want that advice. I like how I told the story. I don't want to change it. But ultimately, I did, because I do trust that wisdom from them is better. And so it can happen. It's not easy, but it can happen. And so my final thought for today, and probably something for us to think about this week, is how well have we done in preparing our kids for fighting the generation that they're, not fighting against their generation, but fighting for their own generation. If we all went out, this would be a terrible thing, but if we all went out and got hit by a bus after today, how prepared are our kids from this point on? Are they ready? And I know that most of us here have adult children. How ready are they? I think many of them probably are. I don't know a lot of your kids directly, but to me, Judges is about this issue, is this cycle of preparing the next generation.